Yeah, I think it's recording, so everything should be fine.
Okay.
So yeah, thanks for accepting the invitation and being on SalonExit.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation. Honestly, it's genuinely an honor. I was so pleased when you were like got back in touch with me, so thank you.
I love your art. There's something amazing about it. How like how long you've been working on your art, like especially like within this style?
Well, I started working professionally like 6 years ago this month. So I actually was in undergraduate studies for 4 years. I didn't end up finishing a degree, but I took a very strange path through undergraduate studies. That's why I didn't end up with a degree. But I left school essentially with this sort of calling, is what I really describe it as, just because I knew that I wanted to pursue this as a career. And I just felt like it was what I was meant to do and why I was on this planet. And so since then I've been doing it. It's about 6 years. Prior to that, like I'm not one of those individuals who, oh, I've been drawing since I was like 2. I was just sketching the trees and stuff. Like I've joked with one of my other friends, like I sort of admire people who are like that, who would sit on the dock, and just like paint the boats and stuff. Like it's pretty, but in high school, I took my first drawing class my senior year, and that was when, or art class, I should say, and I drew my first portrait, and I just really fell in love. And so it's been since then that I've really done figurative work, because when I was a kid, I drew a little bit, but it was all just like rudimentary shapes. I would draw like characters from my video games, and I would even like make my own. I had a world that I had created with like characters and stuff in it, but it was all like rudimentary shape stuff. It wasn't like portraiture detail work.
I rarely think about it that artists maybe not divide, but there is a spectrum between artists who have this calling since whenever, like since forever they remember, and artists who find their calling and then pursue it as if they were always meant to do it. So you would be in kind of more towards that, which is like amazing. People can develop this passion for art from whenever time, or whether they're like 50 years old, 60 or 20 or 18, there's like it's something snaps and they forever, hooked. That's something beautiful about art, I think.
Well,
Is
there's something I do want to interject there because it's funny you mentioned that, but I describe it. It gets kind of weird, but I mean it very sincerely. Like when I felt like this was my life's calling, it felt like sort of a honeymoon period, because I
mm,
was just so like enraptured with and like everything in my life made sense. So as weird as it sounds, like when I look back on my formative years, there's a lot that I recognize that I think was the beginnings of it, because even from my earliest days, I wanted to actually be like a movie director, a video game creator. So there were, and I originally went to undergraduate education at college to study musical theater. So there's always been this part of me that I think has been drawn to expression, that sort of thing. And even that's the thing is, even when I was a kid, like I recognized I even remember when I was like a teenager, I would have like just weird visions of who I was hoping one day to become. And I remember wanting to be like an artistic individual, but I didn't really understand how that was going to manifest. So it might sound really weird, but it's like once I really felt this, I started to notice that so much about my life leading up to this time made sense in a way that seemed like it was all sort of, working together despite my
mm.
maybe knowing necessarily. And I don't think I'm special in that regard. I think that's maybe the case for a lot of other individuals, like you're saying, who do find it maybe later in life that it's something that I think knocks at different times, but it doesn't until it's the correct time, until it's really like that prime moment in one's life. I think that's just sort of the nature of it, that they're going to maybe have to look back in retrospect to see those connections.
Mm. And regarding your style, it's really it's masterful, to put it lightly. You beautifully render your subjects. How did you how did you practice, and what was the kind of uh, curve of learning that to get to that point of your works currently?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, truthfully, when I mentioned I did that first portrait in high school, that one of my last year at high school, that was really like the first time. And I guess my teacher, I had a wonderful teacher who told me, you're really good at this. And so I actually equated it to luck because truthfully, it turned out well. Even looking back, it was a decent portrait. By no means, exceptional, I don't think, but I think that's the thing is I actually for a long time attributed it to, oh, I just happened, it was happenstance, and I would continue to try to draw um, other portraits, other figures, and that sort of thing. But it was really hard because I was continuing to keep up this practice, this habit of it by just kind of regularly attempting, and attempting by looking at something and then looking at a figure, looking at a portrait and trying to draw it basically with my colored pencils or with graphite. And, I would keep doing this for a while, but every time it would turn out well, I would just keep thinking it was luck for the longest time. This
Mm,
manifested especially because like sketching for me has always been really, really difficult. I have a hard time producing something that isn't up to like a certain standard. I've gotten better with that over time, truthfully. And to present day, I'm really grateful to say that I have a really good relationship with sketching now, but I have a very hard time producing something at all that I don't feel is strong enough or I don't feel is of high enough caliber, I guess. And it's
mm,
not even in terms of the realism either. It's not even in terms of like the form coming out correct. It's also because my work is so intentional and there's so much, the conceptual nature is so critical that I feel like I'm wasting time if I say spend like 3 hours on a sketch that doesn't seem like it's really materializing or doesn't seem like it's really, I guess, coming into a conceptual form. Like it doesn't, like maybe I'm not discovering it's tricky. It's been a really tricky game to navigate. And the one thing I will say that I think was a very concrete thing that really pushed me in developing the skill set, I guess you would say, is in undergraduate studies, I took a drawing class and we were required to fill a 60-page sketchbook. So we had to fill each page and we could do still life. Primarily, we could do, I think, 10 pages worth of like whatever we wanted. So for me, I was like, well, I'm doing 10 portraits. There's no doubt about that because I was not really digging the still life that much. But doing that was so hard because, again, I would do these drawings and they felt kind of meaningless, right? Because they're just these sketches. And then at the same time, they didn't always turn out like really great. I think looking back, they were, much better than I was more critical at the time, but it really pushed me to just draw and draw and draw. So I think that is probably one of the things that helped develop the skill within me.
yeah, yeah. In a way, I just wanted to say, in a way, I wanted to ask about within your style itself. I wanted to ask about the mix between portrait and the multitude of additions, those digital, symbolical, and everything, all the kind of everything that goes with comes with your art when you add something on the sides, all of these elements. And I just wanted, it kind of popped into my mind when you were talking about this the portrait versus still life. It kind of like, it's as if you're mixing portraiture with a digital still life in a way, because you're taking like inanimate objects but from digital world and you portraying them on paper. So but yeah, I wanted to ask more broadly about what made you go into that direction.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Thank you for it, honestly, because I consider the human form my vessel of expression, truthfully. So at the pillar, the center of my work is this means to express ideas and emotions. It's through the human figure. And what I've found is I'm a very like zero upward person. I'm very much like start with the flat white and then we build what is necessary. So I'm oftentimes seeking to incorporate only that which I feel will direct towards the final end of a piece. And what I found in my practice over time is that means incorporation for me is very gradual. Like at the beginning, we have like the figure, and then what I'm adding around, whether it's environmental or whether, like you said, it's digital still life that's taken from the digital realm, whether it's realism, like taken from real life around us, objects, that sort of thing. It's always stuff that's coming sort of follow the figure. And so I guess what I'm getting at is my process and the way my practice is kind of developed is I'm always trying to express something more in the work. So I'm always trying to express the ideas and the emotions and ultimately to create this sort of dichotomy of like an emotional conceptual dance. And so whatever I can utilize that will enhance and further that end is what I want to incorporate along with the figure, if that makes sense. And realism itself, and it's one thing I want to stress. Like, obviously, I do utilize a great deal of realism across all of my work. However, I always look at it as a tool. I'm not trying to render a figure realistically in and of itself, right? I'm trying to utilize realism because I recognize that when we as viewers take in the human form, it allows us to see ourselves. There's a great deal of empathy. There's a great deal of just immediate access that it allows us. And so what that does is I've always just found that for me, realism then is that tool to grasp the viewer within, to pull you into that experience, because each work is meant to be its own individual experience, whether that's within the body of work it's coming as a part of, or even in its own solitary existence. My work is also very, very nuanced, and there are a lot of layers. And my hope
Mm,
with every piece is that layers will unfold gradually. Layers will connect with folks over time. That
mm,
whether you're at one point in your life or another, the work is going to speak to you in a unique way. Or, for example, if you are just a specific individual, you're going to grasp some very niche references that are made in the work very, very subtly that other people may never. And so that's the thing for me as well, is I have a really strong focus on, like, building that sort of narrative, building a sort of world within a piece where you have very tiny, minute things that are only picked up by slight and like people who are very specific to a very specific thing.
mm.
But again, I like, it sounds weird because that almost would make my work really hyper specific to a degree that makes it like for no one. But at the same time, because that's happening in tandem with the work itself in a general sense, I'm hoping that it actually resonates with more individuals. And again, I don't do it because I'm like, oh, I'm really, really, really hoping to like grab this particular audience or this crowd. No, it's not a matter of that. It's just that I moved to incorporate these beautiful things because I want to make those little connections, even like the large connections and the minute ones, you know?
Mm, mm. And did this need to express this multi-layered symbolism, appealing to whomever came gradually to, or it was something that, like, since the first portrait, or I don't know, the 10th one, you were like, okay, now I'm going to make this beautiful mosaic of a symbolism on this on the paper?
I think it's like one of those things that it's definitely grown over time, but it's been there since the beginning, because when I look
Uh,
back on like my very first body of work, like in my very, well, yeah, even like my very first body of work, like the second one I'm thinking of actually, I was making subtle references that felt that maybe would even seem tangential, but like it truthfully weren't. And what's funny though is like the longer you do it, I feel like the more chronic you become with it, right? Because it's like I've done like some of the work is like really layered. It's like could we outdo that? Could we make it even more layered and nuanced? And that's never the goal, but I just find that in my practice you
mm,
get so accustomed to building and building. And that's why I describe my work like that. One aspect is I call it neo-expressionism, because the expressionists historically, they were functioning based on the impulse, right? With color. They were working with the impulse and how they were led based on the emotions. And I am very much directed by that, but there is always a great deal of thought and intention behind my choices. So my emotions are governed ultimately by the ideas and by the rationale. And so that's why I describe it as neo-expressionism, because I'm seeking to express, but there is very much an arbiter at the helm of that expression. It is
mm,
filtered very intentionally and for a sincere purpose. And so that's the thing though, is I've grown in my practice where I'm making choices. Every piece becomes an aggregate of choices that I'm trying to stay connected to and committed to on the emotional conceptual levels. And going back to the whole initial point of this question, it's like once you keep doing that over and over and over, you kind of get good at it. And so like your starting point is like you've already made like 50 choices. You know what I mean? Wherein you're starting the piece versus maybe in the
yeah.
past I'd be making fewer at the beginning, but they'd always kind of climb, if that
Mm.
makes sense.
Yeah, and regarding the choices of what to put in or maybe take out, y- your practice is quite not dualistic, but you have this very, it's as if as if you're like rocking two styles. One is very minimalistic and one is this very expressionistic, the neo-expressionist. So how do you decide on which piece should go which direction?
And that's what's so interesting, because again, it's partly dictated by the creative impulse, right? It's partly dictated by like the just that natural inclination to create, to breathe life into these ideas. And then on the other hand, it's very much an active seeking to see the work through, like when I look at my work very much as like I conceive the work in its initial start, right? Like I have the conception of the work, and that's when I can break ground and begin. And my goal with every piece is to stay connected to that initial conceit from the beginning until the very end. And so what that means is emotionally and conceptually. So with the ideas and how I'm feeling with the production needs to stay authentic and honest. So no matter what direction it goes, it needs to just stay true to its original form. The way that I do that, like it's not easy. It's incredibly difficult. And so I write a ton. Writing is a major part of my practice, and it's often in the developmental stages when I'm developing the work. I'll be writing because it's very immediate for me. Putting things in words is just immediately accessible. And so what it allows me to do is immediately try to create these little like hooks, right? So I have like a line or some words or some prose that allows me to understand like, okay, this is where my head is. And when I go back to read that, the hope is I will return to that headspace. And so what that does is it allows me to get back into the work. It's almost like an oil painter where they'll leave the palette sitting and the paint may harden, it may patina on the surface, but all you have to do, if you add a little thinner to it and you mix strong enough, you'll get back there, right? So no matter how long it's been, that's kind of the goal with my writing. And so I make copious amounts of notes. And oftentimes, for example, in the Windows series, I had this working note. And for each new iteration, I put the title and then I would put like some bullet points. I'd put the bullet points of like the conceit, like what is going on, like, and it's not didactic. Again, it's very emotional. It's very prose like. And then even with the colors in that piece, I would say henna is doing, the agency behind this color, because in the Windows series, as an example here, it's 6 colors in the palette and each one functions in a different sort of agency from piece to piece. And so I would need to remember that, when I'm working on like 7 of these pieces at the same time, I need to literally review my note and say, okay, where are we? What is that conceit? And obviously, as a piece develops and gets further along, you're building layers, you kind of get more comfortable with that. It's not always like starting from ground zero and like, I forgot everything, don't get me wrong. But like, that's the thing. I that's my means of trying to stay true to these layers, to this nuance, to this production phase, because I look at the work as like conception, development, and then once I actually break ground, there's an execution phase of the work, because with drawing it takes a ton of hours, and so the execution phase is typically the longest. But I oftentimes find that the work has fully formed in that developmental stage, or in that once it's fully conceived and I can break ground. So yeah, a little bit maybe like on the weeds through that journey with me you just went, but hopefully that makes sense. It's just a very I try to practice a lot of rigor, in my practice. Like I try to be really consistent and really stay connected to the work from start to end. And that's really just all there is.
Considering the fact that you have those really rigorous but kind of emotionally led processes that you go through when you develop a piece, is there a point where you can decisively say that this piece will be successful or not, or are they still having followed all these steps, are there still surprises that you can't really foresee when working on something? And maybe just to the failure in general in art, which is quite important factor on its own. How do you go about it? Do you consider some pieces like less kind of appealing? Do you have favorite pieces? It's an open question, but tackle is however you want.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because I view success as an artist as such an interesting thing, because
Yeah.
truthfully, I don't produce I only produce what I feel led to produce, what I feel truly like just inspired. And so I think one of the ways for me to answer that question immediately is I don't want to produce any work that I would consider a failure or bad, because truthfully, if I'm going to produce it authentically, if I'm going to produce it honestly, no matter what stage I am in my life, my practice, my career, it will always be authentic and true to me. And that's what's important, I think, is it's successful because it was seen through from its initial vision until the final piece. This obviously draws that one like very cliche line of not all of your ideas are good ones, right? I think there's a great weeding out process that I go through regularly. Like I'm beginning this work always with, before we've broken ground, with all the writing, with all these ideas, like I'm trying to really find the work. I'm trying to seek the work through what I'm being inspired in. So I think what that really does is it really helps me to, again, stay authentic to what I'm producing, so that I'm not looking back on something and saying it's a failure, or it's, not successful, or what have you. And so it's weird. I have a strange relationship with my work as well, because I look at my work, truly, it sounds strange, but I look at my work as sort of like my children. And I use the metaphor of a mother, giving birth to her children, like that 9-month period of pregnancy, like truthfully, it's this development and growth of nurturing. And so just like I would hope any mother would, when the child is, born, and you're taking care, and you're loving it, like once it's on its own, it has its own life, it is yours, but at the same time it has its own existence. And that's how I view my work. So the work, it's funny, it always excites me, and I look at it as a viewer, I look at it as an outsider, because I love this work, and I'm desperately wanting it to have its own life. I want it to have its own existence individually, each piece. And so when it comes to success, going back to that, when it comes to like a viewer perspective, it's very tricky, because ultimately my job as the artist is to lead the viewer to that emotional conceptual experience with the work. Success then is partly left in the hands of the viewer, right? It really comes down to, are they having that experience? Now, if I've stayed authentic and true to my practice and know that I've done my part, I have to abandon, I have to truly abandon that notion of how is the viewer experiencing it to a degree,
That's
right?
why that's sorry for interrupting. That's a little
No,
bit of a
no.
luck. That's a little bit of a luck kind of, as you said, relying on the viewer. You can't never predict what will be the outcome, emotional outcome of your piece. So it's kind of like a roulette, artistic roulette.
It kind of is. Again, it's like that's the thing though. I kind of view my whole life as that. I kind of view all of us like that. And when it comes to, if we pursue what it is we were made to do, and we feel that call that's fulfilling, right? We're not going to get the certainty. I don't think we're going to get that sense of certainty in this life. I think looking back, I don't produce work for immediate, reaction. I'm not producing work that's for just trying to appease the viewers. That's what's also really important to remember for me, is it's like I'm trying to produce what's honest and true, right? I'm not trying to chase sales or chase the viewers' appeal or their confirmation, their response, I guess you would say. I love the viewers. I want the sales. I want those connections. I really do, believe me. But at the same time, I have to work in trust. Everything I have to do is in trust, right? That okay, I'm being inspired by this inner need that I feel to produce this piece. I'm going to produce it true to my process from beginning to end. And I have to put it out in the world, and I have to just simply let it exist, because I know truthfully, Matthew, that there is a chance that my work might not really resonate with many folks until I'm gone. And that's something that's very true for art in general and artists in general. And again, I think it's true for just life in general in a lot of respects. Like what we do doesn't always necessarily manifest its fruits in the present moment. And so history's told us of countless examples, especially with the art world, where artists unfortunately go throughout their life, produce a very prolific body of work that is never really recognized. Obviously, like we think of Van Gogh, and I have so much empathy with Van Gogh. I have another friend who's like, please don't cut off your ear. I was like, I'm okay. Don't worry. Don't call anybody. But like, it's just one of those situations where the man was incredibly gifted. He was incredibly talented, and he produced work that resonates with countless individuals, but it was never in his lifetime. So again, you might think of it as like artistic roulette. I like to call it trust, you know, because it's just like, if this is for even just being an artist, like why be an artist? You know what
Trust
I mean?
in
Like,
the trust in the process, or in this pattern of art, coming and going into people's appraisal.
I think it's all honestly, it's trusting the inner need. It's like, again, trusting that I
Oh,
feel this call. You know what I mean? I
mm,
feel like this is what I was
yeah.
given to do. So trusting that somehow it will bring good into the world. Somehow it will improve the lives of others. Somehow it will touch others, I
Mm.
guess.
Speaking a little bit more plainly, what would you do? You have like primary inspirations, artists, maybe styles? You were talking a little bit about in the beginning about your kind of artistic upbringing being more towards cinematography or maybe writing. How is this incorporated as your kind of the base level of your? Would you consider it to be your?
Inspirations and stuff, like
Oh yeah.
direct
So do you have like
inspirations.
also some artists or maybe like styles, except for the what would you mention already?
Yeah, I definitely I have like a handful, you know, like Jean-Michel Basquiat, I really resonate with, and he really is one who first inspired me to start incorporating text directly into my work, for example. And a neo-figurative artist, that's another thing that I really think of as myself as neo-figurative because I'm utilizing the human figure, but towards that like expressionist end. So there's more, it's a vessel of expression. Francis Bacon as well, I resonate with. But truth be told, like when I was a kid and what I really do recognize as my true source of inspiration was it's weird, like I didn't grow up going to galleries, didn't grow up going to exhibitions. But I did love video games, and I was born in 1995, and so I was like the tail end of the two-dimensional era going into the early 3D era when it came to video games. And so for me, I was so enamored with these worlds. I was so enamored with them. It's funny, I didn't even have that many games because didn't have that much money for them at the time. And so I would just play the ones I had over and over and become so enamored with, these colors, these shapes, these forms. And they were what would, again, give me this drive to like create my own characters or my own worlds and stuff. And so looking back, I really think that that's where my creativity was really blossoming, despite the fact that it really doesn't seem like it connects to my work now. Believe it or not, I still actually really love video games, and I found that they're incredibly important for my practice. Just back in 2020, as a matter of fact, I finally made a commitment to play a game every day for like 10 minutes, even if it was the very last thing I did, because I recognized that I needed it for like my mental refreshment. I call it creative input. I think other artists find this as well, where we have these sources of inspiration that are like adjacent to what we do, where they're not really directly what we do, but they somehow just like inspire us to want to create in a general sense. And that's what I find. I'm the type that like I love video game history. I love just like all the inner workings of sort of the medium, and I am one that champions them as an artistic medium too. And so that's the thing. I was used to spend so much time like, just having videos on the background about game history or video games being played. And finally, I had to kind of break through my own insecurity because I'm really afraid of wasting time. And that's
Mm,
why I was always afraid that, oh, I can't play, playing a game's a waste of time, playing a game's a waste of time, despite how much I was, wanting to sort of engage with it. But then when I finally broke through that, I realized that it gave my mind like just a mental refreshment that allowed me to just want to dive deeper into the work.
mm,
So it's funny. I have a very unconventional sort of path into all of it, because again,
mm.
I acknowledge that they still inspire me. I am inspired by other artists, in a general sense, in galleries and exhibitions, that sort of thing. But I just find that like more so these sorts of things from my youth that still have this deep resonance with me that are more than just nostalgia too, because again, like I just enjoy these experiences. I enjoy that experience of that medium. And especially I will say that I'm the type of artist that I find inspiration in daily life. I find inspiration in sort of like the ebbs and flows of just the day to day in a sort of quote unquote normal society,
Mm.
just like a
Yeah.
regular middle class middle class America setting. So
Yeah.
I'm very strange in that regard because another one of my friends like, you should really be more in touch with like an artist community and like talk to more artists. I'm like, yeah, that'd be cool, I bet, but I find my
You be
inspiration doesn't stop, you know?
Yeah, I always had the same feeling about inspiration. I remember being in any of the artistic school settings where teachers would always tell me, okay, you need to prepare the sketchbook where you outline whatever everything that inspired you. You need to put pictures and show us exactly what inspired you. I always had the same idea about this subconscious inspiration where if I had to do it, I would have to present you with 24 hours of a 24-hour video a day, which would be like a basically every time I would be awake or even sleeping while sleeping, I'll have to provide you with the entirety of that and give you that as my inspiration because it's like impossible to pinpoint one inspiration. It's like not really. And sometimes you work on something and you've got an idea without even the slightest idea of what inspired you to do that, but you know that it is this amalgam of experiences that you go through in everyday life. So I think
Yeah.
it's one of the greatest ways of being inspired.
Well, and I will say too, music is huge for me. Like I love music and always have for all my life. And so oftentimes like there are albums, like very specific albums that I will put on when I'm working on certain pieces because I connect for whatever reason. Again, I'm connecting with the ideas and the emotions of that piece by way of this album. And it's funny because the artists, quote unquote, that inspire me are actually more musicians than artists in like the, traditional sense because as a matter of fact, and I say that like I feel like people don't take me seriously when I say this, but I mean it really sincerely. One of my biggest inspirations, and I don't even say inspiration because it's just somebody who I feel like I work very similarly to, and I've always gravitated towards her music is Taylor Swift, which a lot of people look at her as just like a pop star. And so that's why I think it's hard to be taken, like people don't always take me seriously when I say, I'm really inspired by her, but behind the her pop star sensation is really this incredibly gifted compositional songwriter and lyricist who I just have found like I work very similar to her. And it's funny because like I've always gravitated towards her music even before I understood how she worked. And so again, that's just one of those weird examples though, where I probably am more inspired by Taylor Swift than I am by most artists in like art history, you know?
That's amazing. I mean, in a history, throughout the history in however amount of years she'll be probably considered as one of the and like in her way one of the greatest artists, that's for sure. So you yeah, so you can't deny that. I'm not of a much of a pop star person, but in terms of music, but I've been hearing more and more often about Taylor Swift in terms of her like extreme talent and the way she works. So I need to actually look into that. Like what's behind this, or this more kind of this deeper acknowledgement of her talent. I'm quite getting more and more curious about it, like from this just from the curiosity standpoint. I don't know, maybe I'll fall in love.
Well, as you know, you can appreciate certain art without necessarily it being your taste, right? So I would
Yeah.
definitely encourage you just to like look into, her compositional style when it comes to like her lyrics and like what she does with her layers over time, especially with her albums. Because yeah, if her music's not to your taste, like totally get it. It's just at the same time, like with anything, if we don't like a style that an artist works in, we can still appreciate, what they're doing and the strength of their ability and the strength of their ideas, I guess you could say. So,
Yeah.
yes, by all means, explore away, my friend. And you are always welcome to message me and be like, hey, I found this out. This is really cool. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so
I'll
please
let you
don't
know.
hesitate. It's like you're like this contemporary artist. What are you talking about? But like, I know, I just genuinely, like, but it's with me with a lot of musicians, like there are a lot of albums, especially that I just really gravitate towards. And I'm the weird kind of person who like, oh, I love this album. Let's find out more about the musician themselves, or what did they want to say? Like some of my favorite bands are the ones where I listen to their full albums, truthfully. Like I have a ton of music that I like, but I'm the type of person who artists that I love them because I can throw on an entire album and I know I'm going to love the whole thing because I love that vision. You know, like I love Radiohead and The Cure, for example. Those are like two of my also really big favorites because for some reason they just really resonate with me. You know, like I've their albums have been a part of my life for a long time. And then there were just other artists whose I maybe one or two albums will gravitate towards, but maybe less so others, you know, and I just yeah, but needless to say, that's definitely probably a major part of my inspiration is music. And like you said, though, it's in like I was discussing with like daily life, it's there are so many things for me, like a word, a phrase, a color, an image, a sound, like so many things can just set me into this mode of wanting to create something, you know, so
Yeah.
it can really be from anywhere.
Yeah, and it builds up over time. The more you experience, the more ideas it kind of gives you. It's like unpredictable. In a way, it's predictable. You know that if you do something, there might be uh, action to that the reaction to that action artistically. So that's quite nice. I wanted to talk about. I read your artist statement on your website, and there was one particular sentence that caught my attention. I was quite interested about, which quote, he considers himself as a machine receiving input from, and it's a little bit about what we're actually talking about, from his life and the lives of others, that then manifests as a visual work. And to that, taking in consideration what we already kind of spoke about, when I was first looking at your work, I thought it would be more kind of like emotional, which I now kind of discovered it is. How is it that you still gravitate towards those more technical aspect of creating?
It's interesting because you're right. I do, and I'm like this kind of in a general sense where I sort of straddle a lot of middle grounds. I am very much sort of like a dichotomic person where I feel very split. I'm very emotional, but I'm also incredibly pragmatic and rational. And
Yeah.
so that is just natural to like my entire existence. And so naturally it's in my process. I think the reason why I like words like machine is because I am very process oriented, right? And so I have a very specific way that I am inspired in how I notice the way that that becomes directed and produces work eventually and how it sort of manifests through me. And I look at myself, like I was describing earlier, with this like developmental phase, conceiving the work, initially that sort of execution phase. I look at all of this as that really process, as that sort of mechanical aspect, but it's sort of just what happens naturally. It's a very natural process inside of me. So I guess
I
a
think
better
a
word.
natural process and machine is like a antonym of a meaning, but you blend it so skillfully. So that's why it creates such a confusion in my perception. Yet I mean it's clear in your work, but it's super interesting that you kind of go so naturally with it. Do you, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think so. Well, that's what I'm getting at is it's not something that I like, okay, I'm going to be doing things this way, so I am this. It's just one of those things where as I naturally let myself unfold, I'm like, oh, it seems like it's like this. You know, it's like when you give words to something as it's occurring, you know, so it's that meeting ground of trying to understand something while also just observing it from the outside. And then finally you're like, I guess it kind of looks like this, you know. So nothing that I sort of describe myself as is me seeking to be that. It's something that I'm like, I noticed that about me. I noticed that about like it's as I keep growing in this process, I'm like, okay, I am like this. I am definitely like this in looking backwards, you know. So I'm constantly like looking at how I'm producing and like just being an artist in general. It's like I kind of marvel. I love what I do, but I also marvel. I'm like, how do I do this? You know what I mean? I'm just like, I don't understand. And maybe even going back to like what I was describing, where attributing sketches and or portraits to luck and stuff, where it's like, I couldn't tell you, I couldn't teach you how to draw. You know, I couldn't because I'm just I could give you like a lot of tips that would hopefully like get something started for you. You know, it's not to say that you couldn't draw, like just speaking in general use sense, like somebody in general, but I can't really, you know, explain how it operates. I can just over time come to form an understanding of it by way of experiencing it. And that's, I think, what's true with my process. But yeah, the whole input output thing for me, it just feels like I recognize that everything comes through me. Everything, it's experiential. The inspiration is in all these different forms. It comes through me. It inspires me. And then through my same being is the work that comes out of it. And
Mm.
so that's where I look at it. It's like I'm that synthesis inside of me that's taking everything, because I don't like to be described as like totally autobiographical. You know, I like to produce work about others, about us, about life in general. I like to try to really utilize what I have and my ideas in a sense that is relatable beyond just my personal experience, I guess you would say. And so that's the thing about it, I think is really important to recall too, is that what I'm producing isn't meant to just be telling of me, but I have to recognize that because I am the artist, I'm going to leave myself on it. You know, I'm touching it essentially. I'm leaving my being on it to a degree that is unavoidable, you know. But it's hard because if you don't recognize that it's sort of like a push and a pull, it can be easy to say, oh, it's all his work is always about all of his experiences. You know, it's like, well, no, it's not, because I seek to try to produce ideas and stuff that are outside of my own existence. And that's why I put in that artist statement as well, like his life and the lives of others, because it's I want to form like a larger narrative. It's not just my own personal narrative.
Mm. It's as if we are discussing the hard problem of consciousness of actually what it is. If you were to ask in, let's say, I don't know, 50 years, the artificial general intelligence, what is it? Why do you work that in a way that you work? Like how do you think? It's like we don't know exactly how it works. We build it, but we don't know what goes inside of it. So it's like really hard to understand any type of intelligence, even more so artistic kind of artistic one.
I'm like tangentially familiar with that stuff. Truthfully, technology is cool. Don't get me wrong. Science is great. Science is not a bad thing, and not by any means. But I actually really love theology and philosophy because I
Hmm.
like understanding the mechanics of like who we are. I like understanding like the mechanics of our existence as like as human beings, human nature. You know, like I'm genuinely like I'm actually a religious person, and I look at it as though it really fuels my creative sense though, because it inspires me. It inspires me because it's about us, you know, it's about the human person and our existence. And that's actually what inspires me. So because I'm also chronically out of touch and I don't keep up with the news, kind of deliberately, but because of that, yeah, I hear about things filtered through, but it's funny, like I love to listen to podcasts that talk about, you know, like philosophical lectures and stuff, or theological lectures, because I think human nature is sort of unchanging. I think, and that's what's at the core of my work as well, is like our human nature, our human connections. And so I think we're always going to be how we kind of are to a degree, that we're these innate traits and qualities. So when I look at things from like that viewpoint, like looking forward, it's like no matter what kind of comes in history or what occurs, I think it's sort of that history repeats itself notion. And I think there's good reason for that, is things are going to come. We might get scared or worried, right? But ultimately, things always end up shaking out. Things always end up developing. Things always end up coming through in a degree. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, I'm like out of touch and then like really backwards, right? Like I'm always coming from like the behind, but it's like, probably
Yeah.
better off for
I
it,
mean,
I guess.
you can catch up very quickly. You can just ask one of the AI machines to explain everything to you, and they will do it very gladly and surely, very quickly. And but I'm also very interested in theology. At the same time, theology is like sociology, those humanistic studies. But at the same time, I love the scientific aspect of it, and maybe looking at art, human societies, traditions through the prism of invention and how they were like impacting art. You were talking about you were talking about the impressionism, where it was hugely led by scientific discoveries of the light, of the diffractions, of understanding how light work. And I was always super interested in that. So yeah, I would highly encourage you to do so in your spare
Oh,
time. The
I'm
same
sure.
I will do with Tay.
Well, I was gonna say, I'm sure you're a lot like me, where in general, aren't you just kind of like inspired by like stuff that's exciting? Like when like
Yeah,
or other
yeah,
people, when other people get excited about stuff, I'm like, yes, tell me more. Like, no, I have absolutely no idea about botany nor any of it, but you are really into it, so please, like, yes,
yeah,
all that stuff. So I know I appreciate you mentioning that to me because you're right. There is like I'm sure I really would take to it if I got, more into it. And as a matter of fact, I will say when I was a kid, along with like just the other things, I was really inspired by outer space and like astronomy, just like the planets, the solar systems, the galaxies, So like there is part of me that has always been drawn to like all those kinds of scientific discoveries. So I mean, there's no doubt that if I
yeah.
started digging into the rabbit hole, I'd get lost.
Amazing. Um, Maybe I'll ask you one more question, one more technical question regarding your actual pieces.
Okay.
I was interested in how did you come about to make those epoxy covered one?
Oh
Are
yeah,
they
it's
epoxy?
resin. Yeah.
Yeah, resin. Yeah, I've never seen anything like it. Yeah, could you speak a little bit to it?
Absolutely. So it's so funny. I produced a body of work for an exhibition in 2018, and they were drawings on wood panels. I was drawing directly on the wood panel, and I needed to find a way to actually seal the surface, because the work would actually, colored pencil does this weird thing. It's called wax bloom, where the wax actually oxidizes. And so you get this weird sort of chalky dust over top of the work. I actually, whenever I sit down on a piece, I take a tissue and I like dab because even after like a day, there's going to be that little layer of dust. And so I needed to find a way that I could, encase the work essentially. And so that's when I discovered art resin, which this is not a product placement, but they just happen to be the brand that makes it. It's called art resin. Um, and it really worked well to seal the work. But what I did notice is it did slightly alter the colors only because it was working with the wood below it. There was a saturation. And
Mm,
then my framer had somebody working for him who was a dear man who was unfortunately left us, and his God rest his soul, but his name was Alfred. And I was sharing my conundrum because when I would use resin on paper, it would saturate the edges of the paper and it would get really blotchy. And so I wanted to start doing work on paper that I could resin, but I didn't know what kind of paper to use. And then he suggested oil paper, which essentially oil paper is for oil paint, and it takes like soluble, water soluble or oil soluble pigment without bleeding, essentially. It's very coarse. It's very, very coarse. It has quite a tooth to it. And so for drawing and pencils, it's actually very rigid, and it's doing fine details can be incredibly precarious on it for one thing, especially colored pencils where erasing is kind of not always the thing. And so when I realized that I could utilize that colored pen or utilize oil paper with my colored pencils, and then I could resin over top it on the wood panels, it really solved that problem because I wanted to be able to use paper. I love working on paper. And truthfully, that whole body of work called postmodern that utilizes that means it's the wood panels with oil paper and then resin sealing over top. Part of the reason why I was really moved to produce in that manner is because as a drawer, typically, if I want work finished and presented well, I was kind of believing for a long time, and I don't totally believe this now, that it had to be framed. I didn't want to exhibit anything unframed or works on paper, so to speak. And so I really had this problem where I couldn't afford to actually, get everything framed, but I wanted to produce work as quickly as a painter that I could also then market and be able to like allow viewers to invest in at lower prices, because when you also frame, obviously you're adding so much to the cost, what have you.
yeah.
And so it became this perfect marriage for me where I cut my own wood panels. My framer actually attaches stretcher bars to the backside with a hanger. So that's how they hang without seeing anything on the out, like other part from that. And then I basically, once a piece is completely finished, I epoxy it to the wood panel and allow it to rest. And then I do a resin pour over top of it. And some colors do react to the resin. It's very specific though. It's not every color. And so I have to kind of just learn as I go when it comes to doing some tests and stuff.
Science.
Yeah, but believe me, it's interesting. One of my series, 20th Century Royalty, I deliberately don't test before because it's part of like the bombast of the series to just make these really bold choices, not always knowing if it's going to turn out. But again, that's part of the conceit. So like that's why we do it there. But that's the thing is I do one layer and then the fibers of the paper actually rise up and form little bubbles. So I have to sand down the first layer and scratch the dickens out of it. And then I have to do a second layer. And the second layer is what allows for as much clarity as possible. So that's how it works. It's basically like a 36, 48-hour process in total for each piece. But man, when I'm like on it, I can set up my resin table and do like 3 at a time because they're small, you know? And so I'm like, boom, 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 and then let them dry, you know? It's
like,
yeah.
it's like cutting a gem. They look at the end like gems. They have this beautiful, expensive feel to them that makes them way more feel. They seem more tangible, at least from the photo. Probably in real life, they're even more kind of spectacular. But yeah, it's a beautiful experimentation and style in general. It's really nice.
Thank you. Well, did I mention I'm very process oriented? So obviously, like when I learned the process of resin pours, I was like, oh heck yeah, I'm so good at like, you know, doing these little regimented things. And it's like, yeah, I could, you know, because there are a ton of little tiny steps, like making sure you tape certain things off or whatever, and leveling and balancing. And so yeah, I love doing it. I really do. But I've also really discovered that, hey, as an artist, as a drawer, I can produce works on paper that can be exhibited. I can exhibit works on paper, and I think there's a great deal of intimacy actually when I'm producing work that is unframed and that is able to be possessed by the viewer unframed, and the viewer can make that decision. And that's actually my newest body of work that's ongoing. And a lot of my body's work and a lot, especially postmodern, those series, they all are ongoing. They're not finite. But my newest body of work, that's the thing is it's been really exciting for me because I'm producing these works that are on paper that I can just share immediately. You know, I don't have to worry about framing. I don't like there's a presentation aspect that you can just kind of grab onto and latch onto. But yeah, it's all a learning experience for me, you know. So even like the whole resin thing, it was a lot of just discovering as I kind of make this journey.
I have this one question that, speaking about clichédness, but I think we don't ask that question enough. What is art?
Oh my goodness, I know it's like such a terrible question. I terrible in like the sense, you know, where it's like, oh, how do I answer that? And of course, like you're talking to me, you're like, I don't know why you would even ask that. See, I've already like prologued way too long, but you know, art is just like that. I think art is the means of transcending our reality, like transcending the concrete. I think it's like a bridge between our like physical and spiritual beings. I think it reminds us that there is more to life, that there is more meaning to life, that there is that our emotional, our physical selves, our emotional selves, there is really something there, that there really is something going on there that is worth exploring and acknowledging. And I just think that art is that which allows us to contemplate things that are beyond us, essentially. And so, yeah, I'll just
Beyond
stop there.
intellect,
Hopefully that's enough. What's that?
beyond our intellect, or just the realm of anything we can experience?
I think yes, to a degree. I think beyond our intellect, beyond like where reason stops, I think like where the emotions kind of take over. I think there are so many things about us and about our lives that no amount of words will fully explain, no amount of research will fully come to the bottom of. I think there's so much that from now until the end of time, we will just always not know because we are finite creatures in that sense, like in our physical beings. And so I think art is that which allows us to acknowledge that there is hopefully more, that there is hopefully greatness, and there is like again, and like I said, like I try not to be like super like brazen because I don't want to like make people feel like I'm being pushy, but I am a religious person. So for me, I sort of look at like, yeah, we have a spiritual self, like, yeah, there is more to this life. So for me, I look at it as like art is that which helps us while we still can only see like on this side of the veil. It helps us break through that veil to what is hopefully a greater life beyond just this one, that there is more than just what we can physically experience, I guess.
Mm. Oh, that's amazing what you said, where the reason kind of ends. Um, Weirdly enough, art is what very often propels any type of changes, whether culture or
Yeah.
scientific. Artists come up with weird shit, and then it ends up being kind of realized and put into like reality. So yeah, it's a beautiful, beautifully put.
So thank you so much for this, Matthew. Have a great rest of your
Thanks.
day. Okay.
Have a great rest of the day. Bye bye.
Bye, buddy.